Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a really powerful, but honestly often overlooked tool for charitable giving, the designated fund.
So let's start with a big question, one that I think a lot of us ask ourselves at some point. You find a cause you really truly care about, and you want to make sure your support doesn't just stop. You want to build a legacy that's permanent and predictable, something that keeps working long after you're gone. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover in this explainer. We'll kick things off by talking about how to create that forever support. Then we'll get into exactly what a designated fund is. From there, we'll compare it to your other options, dig into the super important tax and legal stuff, and then wrap it all up with a simple 5-step playbook you can actually use. All right, let's dive right in. How do you actually create that kind of lasting impact? The kind that's both predictable and perpetual.
Well, the answer is this really elegant tool called a designated fund. And the best way to think about it, it's like putting your support for a charity you love on autopilot. You set it up one time, you name the organization, and the fund just takes care of the rest, creating this steady stream of income for them forever.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, right? But how does it actually work in practice? Let's break down the mechanics, which are actually pretty simple. It really is a simple 3-step process, which is kind of beautiful. First, you set up the account and put the money in. Then a community foundation, they're the experts, they invest and manage everything. And finally, the grants just flow automatically to the charity you picked. It's truly a set it and forget it kind of deal when it comes to legacy giving. Now, when you set one of these up, you've got a really important choice to make. You can go the endowed route, where the main chunk of money, the principal, is invested forever. That gives perpetual support. Or you can choose a non-endowed fund. Think of this as a spend-down fund, where all the money gets granted out over a set period for a bigger, more immediate punch. So what are we talking about in terms of actual dollars? Well, for a typical endowed fund, the community foundation is usually going to pay out somewhere around 4 to 5% of the fund's value every single year. And what that means for the charity is a super reliable, predictable stream of cash they can actually count on. Okay, so this brings us to a really important point. A designated fund is an awesome tool, for sure, but it's not the only game in town. So how does it really stack up against the other big players like donor-advised funds, you'll hear those called DAFs, and of course, private foundations? The biggest difference, and this is really the key, it all comes down to control. A designated fund is what you use when you know without a doubt exactly who you want to support forever. It's locked in and automated. A DAF, on the other hand, gives you flexibility. You get to recommend where the money goes over time. And then you have the private foundation, which is all about maximum control, where a board, usually your family, calls all the shots. And then you've got to think about the complexity and the cost, right? The administrative headache. Designated funds and DAFs, they're designed to be easy, super streamlined, low fees. A private foundation, though, that's a whole different beast. It's its own legal entity, which means lawyers, tax filings, and way, way higher costs. So when you look at it all together, it becomes pretty clear. The best choice really just depends on what you're trying to do. If you want simple, forever support for one charity, the designated fund is a perfect match. If you want to stay flexible, a DAF is probably your best bet. And if you want total control and don't mind the complexity, well, that's where a private foundation comes in. All right, let's switch gears and talk about the important stuff, the tax and legal details. This is kind of the fine print, but honestly, it's absolutely crucial, especially if you're a high net worth donor. So contributions are tax deductible, of course. You can put in cash or even better appreciated assets like stocks to avoid capital gains. But here is a huge advantage, especially for donors over 70 and a half. It's potential eligibility for something called a qualified charitable distribution, or a QCD, right from an IRA. And this is where things get really interesting, because the IRS has a very specific rule. It says, flat out, that you cannot make one of these QCDs to a donor-advised fund, period. So that creates a really clear line in the sand between DAFs and other options. And that is why a designated fund can be such a game changer. See, because you give up the right to advise on the grants. Remember, it's fixed from the start. It very often does qualify as a place to send your QCD. Now, this is a massive planning opportunity. But, and this is important, you absolutely have to confirm the details with your CPA and the foundation first. Okay, let's pull this all together.
How do you actually do this? Let's walk through a simple 5-step playbook to take this from an idea to a reality. It's actually a super clear 5-step process. First, you pick your sponsor, that community foundation, and decide, is this going to be endowed for forever or a spend down? Second, you name the charity or charities you want to support. Third, you fund it with cash, stocks, maybe that QCD. Fourth, and this is really important, you set up instructions for what happens if that charity ever goes away. And fifth, you just do a quick annual review to see how it's doing. See? The whole process is built for clarity and, really, for peace of mind.
So, when it's all said and done, the choice between a designated fund and something else really boils down to one simple question. Is the legacy you want to build all about fixed, forever support, or is it about having ongoing flexibility? Your answer to that is what will guide you to the perfect tool to bring your own unique charitable vision to life.